The first light over Okinawa on April 1st, 1945, looked almost peaceful. From a cave cut deep into the limestone above the coast, Colonel Hiromukai Yahara wiped the lenses of his field glasses and raised them toward the sea. For a brief moment, all he saw was the line of the horizon, a faint silver edge where the sky met the water. Then the shapes began to resolve. First a few dots, then dozens, then hundreds. Ships. So many that the colonel's mind resisted turning the blur into individual hulls. Transport vessels in long, straight rows. Warships in outer rings. Smaller craft darting between them like insects around a hive. Behind him, the air in the cave was warm and stale, filled with the quiet murmur of staff officers talking over maps and radio sets. Electric bulbs hung from rough wooden beams. A faint smell of diesel and damp limestone lingered over everything. Report from the Western observation posts, Colonel, a young staff officer said, offering a clipboard. They confirm large-scale landing formations off the Higuchi coast. At least several hundred ships already identified. Several hundred, Yahara repeated quietly, still looking through the glasses. The number was already useless. The fleet stretched so far that his field of view could not contain it. It felt less like an armada and more like a moving coastline of steel. He lowered the binoculars and turned back into the cave. On the main table, a sheet of transparent plastic lay over a detailed map of Okinawa. Grease pencil lines marked defensive belts, artillery positions, cave networks, supply routes. In the center of the southern half of the island was a single word, Shuri, the core of the defense. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, commander of the 32nd Army, stood over the map with his hands lightly resting on the table's edge. His expression was calm, almost distant, as if observing a training exercise rather than the beginning of one of the largest battles in the Pacific. "How many divisions do they land in the first wave, Colonel?" he asked without looking up. Yahara glanced at the latest intelligence sheets. 3 Marine divisions and several U.S. Army divisions in the initial phase are probable, General. The exact order is not yet clear, but their transport capacity suggests that number at a minimum. He did not say the other part aloud. Each of those divisions, by their estimates, brought more artillery than his entire army. On the northern wall of the cave, a large board showed the composition of the 32nd Army, the 24th Division, the 62nd Division, independent brigades, local defense units, support troops. On paper, a substantial force. In reality, a mix of experienced formations and under-equipped units, all cut off from resupply. Outside the cave, the first echoes of distant naval guns rolled across the island like muted thunder. Beach defenses? Ushijima asked. Empty, as planned, Yahara replied. Forward elements are observing only. No major units are committed along the coast. We have seen what happens to garrisons who try to hold the sand. He was thinking of other islands. Atolls where enthusiastic defenders had tried to contest the landing and had been erased under naval bombardment before they could even see the attackers. Okinawa would be different. Here, the army would wait inland, in caves and cut positions, drawing the enemy into prepared fields of fire. That was the theory. But theories did not look out to sea and see a horizon made of ships. The radios crackled as reports came in from the coastal platoons. Landing craft were forming up into crescent-shaped lines. Smoke screens billowed over parts of the approaches. The tempo of naval fire increased in measured waves, lifting from suspected positions and shifting inland, as if guided by an invisible script. "Look at this," a senior artillery officer murmured, placing a fresh sheet on the table. It showed estimated enemy artillery strength. For 1 Marine Division, he said, tapping the numbers, organic divisional artillery, attached corps artillery, and likely naval support allocated per sector. If we include ships and air support, we are looking at more than 10 times, possibly 12 times, the firepower we can concentrate in any comparable area. Ushijima looked up at that. 12. It depends on how we count aircraft, the officer said carefully. But yes, General, that is the scale. In a corner of the cave, a telephone operator covered one earpiece, listening intently. Message from the northern sector, Colonel. They report that the sea is full of ships as far as the eye can see. Those are their exact words. Yahara nodded, then looked back at the map. Colored pins representing American units began to appear along the Higuchi beaches. Each pin was more than a symbol. Each one carried its own network of guns, vehicles, engineers, radios, and supply lines. The colonel straightened slowly. We always knew they would come with superior numbers, he said quietly. What we are seeing now is something else. General, this is not just an army. It is an entire production system arriving on our shore. Outside, as the first wave of landing craft ground up onto the sand, many Marines encountered almost no opposition. There were no mass machine guns on the beach ridges, no dramatic charges at the waterline, only scattered fire and a strange, unsettling quiet. The battle for Okinawa had begun. But for the Japanese commanders inside the limestone ridge, the truly unsettling part was not the presence of the enemy. It was the realization that their own calculations might have underestimated the scale of what was coming. By mid-morning, the beaches looked less like a battlefield and more like a construction site assembled at impossible speed. From a forward observation slit halfway up a coastal slope, a Japanese junior officer pressed his eye against a scope and tried to write down what he was seeing. He managed only fragments. Landingkraftluringramps. Amphibious tractors crawling over coral. Tanks rolling forward in pairs. Bulldozers already pushing low earthen walls into place. Trucks forming queues without visible confusion. Signal flags on the sand. Radios everywhere. Back in the Shuri Command cave, runners brought in those field notes, rough sketches, and hurried impressions, which clerks pinned to a board next to more formal intelligence summaries. The picture that emerged was not of a chaotic, vulnerable landing, but of an intricate mechanism functioning with practiced ease. Yahara stood with his arms folded as a staff officer briefed the senior commanders. 1st and 6th Marine Divisions confirmed in the beachhead, the officer reported, pointer moving across the map. Elements of Army divisions are landing as well, but the Marines are forming the main spearhead. Their established frontage is already wider than we expected for the first day. He flipped a sheet on his clipboard. Each of their divisions includes 3 infantry regiments, divisional artillery, and attached support units. But we must not think in terms of infantry alone. The proportion of heavy weapons is far higher than in our own formations. He pointed to a column of figures. For example, the 6th Marine Division, 54 artillery pieces within the division itself. That does not include additional core artillery attached to support them. Engineers with armored bulldozers. Tank battalions with modern Shermans, some equipped with special devices for dealing with obstacles. And they operate with close support from their own aircraft. One of the older regimental commanders frowned. We also have artillery, Colonel. Yes, General, the briefer replied carefully. Our divisions on Okinawa have roughly 40 guns each, mostly smaller calibers, many moved into caves by hand. We have a few heavier, but they are limited in number and ammunition. Our total artillery for the entire army is exceeded by what one amphibious corps can bring against a single sector when we include naval guns. A murmur moved through the cave. Yahara watched the faces of the officers. No one was surprised that the Americans were strong. What seemed to unsettle them was the idea that their entire island defense could be matched and surpassed by a single component of the enemy force. He stepped forward. Consider not just how many guns they have, he said, but how they use them. Their fire direction systems allow multiple units to coordinate their fire in seconds. Forward observers embedded with their infantry can call for naval shells, army artillery, or airstrikes on a single radio net. We, by contrast, must pass requests up and down the chain, and many of our units lack reliable radios entirely. He placed his hand flat over the southern half of the map. We plan to trade space for time, he continued, to let their strength dissipate as they advanced into our ridges. But the reports from previous campaigns are clear. Where they choose to focus, they do not simply push. They reshape the ground with explosives until positions disappear. Our cave fortifications are strong, but they are not invulnerable to repeated strikes from sea and sky. General Ushijima listened without interrupting. He had been chosen in part for his calm temperament, his ability to absorb bad news without reacting impulsively. We cannot undo the disparity in equipment, he said at last. We can only decide how we ask our soldiers to meet it. There was a pause as the statement settled. A phone operator raised his voice. Message from the division to the north of the landing area. They report that enemy units have already reached several inland roads. Their estimates suggest at least 50,000 personnel ashore by noon. 50,000, one of the staff officers repeated. With that level of support, they are effectively much more than that. He was not exaggerating. Each American formation carried within it a density of firepower that had no counterpart in the Japanese order of battle. Heavy weapons that, in Japanese divisions, were concentrated at higher levels, appeared in American units all the way down to company and sometimes platoon strength. In the early afternoon, another officer from the intelligence section arrived carrying a newly compiled chart. He unrolled it over the map, weighing down the corners with stray shell casings used as paperweights. "This is our current best estimate," he said. "If we count organic artillery, attached corps artillery, naval guns in direct support, and air sorties dedicated to one Marine division's front, the effective firepower in that segment may be up to 12 times that of a Japanese division facing it. Possibly more if we consider the endurance of their supply system." The room went quiet. 12 times, someone murmured. It was not just the number. It was what the number implied. Normal tactics assumed that a defender might offset numerical inferiority with terrain, surprise, determination. But what if every attempt to concentrate defenders simply created a denser target for an opposing force that could call down shells in hundreds, then thousands, whenever it wished? In one corner of the command cave, a simple chalkboard showed ammunition stocks, rounds for each artillery piece, mortar shells, small arms ammunition. The running tallies were not high even at the beginning. They would go in one direction only. Outside, the Marines continued to move inland almost unopposed, puzzled by the lack of serious resistance. Some thought the bombardment had shattered the defenders. Others suspected a trap. In a sense, both were correct and neither was. The trap was real, a layered defense around Shuri, with interlocking fields of fire and deep tunnels. But the bombardment had done something that neither side could see yet. It had already begun to alter the psychology of the defenders, not just through explosions, but through what those explosions represented, a glimpse of an opponent whose ability to generate force seemed to have no visible ceiling. When the staff officers of the 32nd Army had first drawn up the defense of Okinawa, they had treated the terrain as their strongest ally. The southern half of the island was a maze of low ridges and limestone outcrops cut by small valleys and ravines. Over months of labor, engineering units and infantry details had turned those features into a hidden network. Caves connected by tunnels. Firing positions carefully sited to cover approaches. Storage chambers for food and ammunition carved deep into the rock. Standing next to one of the large terrain models in a planning room several weeks before the landing, Yahara had watched officers trace potential American routes with the tips of their pencils. "They will come here," one had said, tapping the coastal plain. "Then they must climb these ridges. The angle of approach makes tanks difficult to use. Artillery cannot easily hit positions on the reverse slopes. If we hold these lines, we can absorb their attacks and make every meter costly." At the time, the logic had been persuasive. On other islands, Japanese forces had inflicted serious losses when attackers were forced into choke points or exposed slopes. Terrain could not eliminate an opponent's firepower, but it could blunt it. Now, with the sound of distant naval guns echoing through the ridges, that assumption began to look less secure. An engineer officer standing near the entrance of the Shuri cave turned his cap in his hands as he described fresh details to Yahara. "Colonel, our survey of recent bombardment craters shows that some of the shells from the larger ships are penetrating deeper than we expected. In a few cases, impact points on the surface produced collapses 3 or 4 levels down in the tunnels. The limestone helps, but it is not an absolute shield." Yahara listened carefully. "And the cave positions themselves?" "Many are intact," the engineer replied, "but the entrances are vulnerable. If they focus on sealing openings instead of trying to crush everything inside, they can neutralize positions even without destroying their interiors." In another part of the island, a company commander of the 62nd Division felt that vulnerability in a more immediate way. His unit occupied a series of caves on a ridge overlooking a potential approach route. The men had spent weeks bringing up ammunition and supplies, reinforcing entranceways, preparing firing slits. Now, as they listened to the steady drumbeat of the bombardment on more forward positions, the reality of the plan settled over them. They would not be racing to stop invaders at the waterline. They would be waiting here, inside the rock, listening as another army moved across the island toward them. One of his junior NCOs looked at the stacked ammunition boxes and carefully folded blankets in a corner. "We could stay in here for months, sir," he said. The commander did not respond immediately. Theoretically, yes. The caves had been stocked for a long defense. But the theory assumed that resupply, even limited, would be possible, and that communications with higher headquarters would remain intact. It also assumed that the enemy would be content to press against the lines without systematically dismantling them. At Shuri, new reports continued to arrive. American engineers were not simply unloading equipment. They were reshaping the island. In some sectors of the beachhead, bulldozers worked almost continuously, leveling ground for supply dumps, roads, and artillery positions. Within days, inland tracks became graded routes wide enough for 2 trucks to pass. Damaged vehicles were towed to improvised repair points, where maintenance teams worked under canvas shelters. Yahara stood over a fresh aerial photograph taken by a reconnaissance plane that had managed to get through the American air umbrella early on. The image showed a grid of tire tracks, supply piles, gun pits, and trench lines that had not existed a week before. In previous campaigns, he said quietly to a fellow staff officer, our defenders tried to hold against landings before the enemy could organize. Here, they are already organized. They have brought the workshop with them. The other officer nodded reluctantly. We had hoped the beaches and the coral would delay them. In a sense, they did, Yahara replied. But delays are irrelevant if the other side can bring 12 times as much force to bear and replace what they expend without difficulty. He did not raise his voice. There was no need. Everyone in the cave could see the supply figures. In the evenings, when the sound of bombardment receded slightly and the staff slipped into a strange, exhausted quiet, some officers found themselves thinking back to pre-war doctrine. Manuals that emphasized the power of the offensive spirit, the value of will, the ability of determined soldiers to overcome material disadvantages. No one doubted the importance of those qualities. The units dug in around Shuri were composed of men prepared to fight to the end. But those manuals had been written for a different type of war, in a different world. A world where artillery was limited, logistics fragile, ammunition finite for both sides. What they faced now was something else. A war where one side could fire as many shells in a week as the other might store for an entire campaign. In that context, even the solid limestone of Okinawa began to look less like a sanctuary and more like a temporary shelter from a storm that would not run out of rain. The first major warning of what that storm would really look like came on April 19th. In the hours before dawn, light rain dusted the ridges around Shuri. The sky was low and grey, a muted ceiling over a landscape of shallow valleys and rocky slopes. In the Japanese positions, men checked weapons, adjusted helmet straps, and peered out from cave mouths toward the American lines still hidden beyond the next folds of ground. In the Shuri command cave, Yahara and his staff stood around the operations table, listening to the ticking of clocks and the uneven crackle of radios. They knew the Americans were preparing a major attack. Captured prisoners had spoken of schedules and objectives. Artillery registration had been heavier in recent days. Patrols had encountered more coordinated movements. At 6 o'clock, the island shook. 27 battalions of American field artillery opened fire almost simultaneously. 324 guns, from light pack howitzers to heavy pieces, sent shells arching over the lines toward the Japanese positions anchored on the Shuri defensive belt. The sound rolled through the ridges like continuous thunder. In some caves, dust drifted down from ceilings. In others, lights flickered as generators vibrated. In the command cave, the map on the table seemed to tremble slightly as the air outside pulsed with each new wave. Yahara stepped to the entrance and looked out. He could not see the shells themselves, of course, but he could see their effects. On distant slopes, columns of earth and smoke erupted in overlapping patterns. It was not random. The impacts walked across ridgelines, paused, then shifted, as if guided by an unseen hand. Observers called in to report. Number 3 Company reports heavy impact on forward slopes, entrances damaged but interior intact. Artillery position near point 58 hit repeatedly, 1 gun out of action. Communications with the forward observation post lost, no answer on either channel. Yahara returned to the table. A battery commander from one of their own artillery units stood nearby, helmet still on, face lined with fatigue. Colonel, the man said quietly, we train to deliver concentrated fire. But what they are doing, this is something else. It is as if an entire region of the front is under one continuous, coordinated blow. The initial barrage lasted 90 minutes. For the men inside the caves, it felt longer. When the American guns finally lifted their fire to targets deeper inland, the silence that followed was almost disorienting. It did not last. As the last echoes of the barrage rolled away, the sky above Shuri filled with aircraft. From his forward command slit, A Japanese observer watched as rows of American planes swept over the ridges. Fighters dove in pairs to strafe suspected positions. Dive bombers pulled up sharply after releasing their loads into cave mouths and trench lines. In some sectors, the air assault overlapped seamlessly with new artillery concentrations, so that the defenders could not tell whether an explosion had come from sea, land, or sky. In the Shuri Cave, a liaison officer from a nearby division described what was happening on his sector. "Colonel, they are not firing blindly," he said. "When a position returns fire, they adjust onto it quickly. It is as if multiple observers are watching the same point from different angles. If one method does not suppress it, another follows within minutes." Radios, Yahara said. They are integrating everything through their communications. He thought of the comparison chart that had been drawn up weeks before. One of their divisions, roughly 40 guns, mostly smaller calibers, with ammunition stockpiles that had taken months of effort to move into caves. One of their divisions facing a marine division whose artillery could be augmented at will by battleships offshore and aircraft overhead. 12 times the firepower, someone had said. In that moment, it felt like a conservative estimate. On the American side, staff officers were busy as well. In a fire direction center several kilometers behind the lines, U.S. Marines stood over their own maps and plotting boards, translating frontline requests into coordinates. A forward observer on a ridge radioed in calmly, voice raised slightly over the background noise. "This is Able 1. We are receiving machine gun fire from the right edge of that small grove ahead of our front, near the large rock outcropping. Requesting fire for effect, danger close." Within minutes, distant guns adjusted, and shells began to fall along the indicated line. The observer watched through binoculars and corrected by a few dozen meters. The next salvo aligned almost perfectly with the target. The Fire Direction Center noted the adjustment and logged it for future reference, so that the same coordinates could be engaged again without delay. From the Japanese perspective, the effect was that resistance points which revealed themselves by firing were rapidly isolated under concentrated bombardment. In traditional doctrine, a well-sited machine gun nest or hilltop trench could hold off attackers for a long time, especially on broken terrain. On Okinawa, those positions had lifespans measured in minutes once identified. In the afternoon, engineers moved up behind the American infantry. Yahara received new reports, specialized tanks with mounted devices advancing toward cave systems, armored bulldozers sealing openings, demolition teams working in coordinated teams with riflemen and tank crews. These were not improvised methods. They were the products of years of trial and error across previous campaigns. As the day ended, the ridges around Shuri were scarred by fresh craters and blackened slopes. In many cave complexes, the defenders had survived, withdrawing deeper into the darkness while the entrances took the blows. In others, communication lines were cut, entrances blocked, ventilation compromised. In the command cave, the noise from outside moderated to an intermittent rumble. Radios continued to spit static and voices. Yahara looked over the casualty estimates and ammunition usage reports. Their own artillery had fired where it could, but each salvo had to be measured against limited stocks. Across the table, an operations officer traced the day's American gains in pencil. They were modest in terms of distance, a ridge here, a valley there. But the cost in ammunition on the attacking side was something entirely different. "We could never fire like that," the officer said quietly. "Not for a day. Certainly not for weeks." Yahara did not disagree. He thought again of the initial strategic assumptions. The belief that terrain, preparation, and determination could slow the enemy enough to make his advance too costly. The idea had not been wrong in itself, but it had been formed in a world where both sides were bound by similar limits. Now, watching the methodical way in which the Americans applied their resources, the colonel understood something that went beyond any single bombardment. The enemy's divisions were not simply larger or better equipped. They were fueled by a system that could turn factories thousands of kilometers away into shells, vehicles, and spare parts on a coral island in a matter of weeks. It was that system that gave a single Marine division the equivalent of a dozen Japanese divisions' firepower on any given day. And that system showed no sign of exhaustion. In the weeks that followed, the pattern continued. American artillery pounded suspected strongpoints. Aircraft swept overhead in an almost continuous relay. Naval guns reached deep into the island whenever heavy resistance was reported. Between these blows, infantry advanced cautiously but steadily, probing, withdrawing when necessary, then returning with more information and more precise support. Inside the Japanese defense, the effect was cumulative. At first, units reported the loss of specific positions, an observation post here, a gun there, a collapsed entrance. Then reports shifted in tone. Communications with some companies stopped entirely when cables were cut and runners could not get through. Batteries that had once been the pride of the sector fell silent, their guns damaged beyond repair or starved of shells. In the Shuri cave, the ammunition board became a daily ritual of quiet concern. Clerks updated the chalk marks for each category. Numbers never went up. They only went down. A logistics officer pointed at one row. For this artillery battalion, we carried in enough ammunition for what we thought would be an extended engagement, he said. We assumed we would ration it over multiple plan phases. But the intensity of the fighting and the need to respond to their pushes have forced us to fire far more quickly than anticipated. At this rate, we will be left with a few scattered rounds within weeks. Yahara listened, then looked at the parallel board that tracked American consumption as best they could infer it. The estimates were rough, but the trend was obvious. The volume of fire on the American side did not noticeably diminish as the weeks went by. We are watching the difference between a limited storehouse and a flowing river, he said. We started this battle with stocks that took months to assemble. They began knowing that ships would replenish them as quickly as they emptied their magazines. He was not speaking metaphorically. Observers on the coast reported daily the steady arrival of new supply ships. Lighters and landing craft moved pallets of shells, fuel drums, crates of rations to shore in seemingly endless cycles. On the beaches, cranes and bulldozers arranged the material into orderly stacks. Trucks carried it inland along newly built roads that bypassed damaged sections with fresh gravel and timber bridges. The Japanese, by contrast, had brought almost everything they would have for the entire battle with them before the first shell landed. The sea lanes were effectively closed by American control of the surrounding waters and skies. Attempts to move supplies even across the island at night became increasingly hazardous as American patrols and reconnaissance aircraft adapted. Inside the Shuri headquarters, psychological shifts were subtle but real. In the early days, staff briefings included plans for counterattacks, ideas for limited offensives to push back penetrations, to retake key ground, to re-establish lines. Such actions had been central to Japanese doctrine in earlier campaigns. Now, even proposing an offensive felt more like an act of symbolism than a realistic option. Officers knew that any force large enough to mount a meaningful counterattack would inevitably be seen, fixed, and subjected to the same concentrated fire that had already greeted so many smaller movements. Gathering units in one place did not create strength. It merely created a target. One evening, as rain tapped lightly at the cave's entrance, Yahara and a few senior officers sat on low stools around the map table. The atmosphere was unusually quiet. Our original concept, one of the divisional commanders said slowly, was to make the Americans pay for each advance with time and cost, to show them that every gain on our soil would require them to commit beyond what they were prepared to accept. Yahara nodded. And now? The general asked. Now, Yahara replied carefully, choosing his words, we see that their capacity is larger than we assumed. They continue to commit, and each commitment is supported by a level of firepower we cannot match. We suspected they had superiority in numbers. What we are learning is that they also have endurance in a way we have not faced before. He thought of the phrase he had read in a pre-war Western military text, something about industrialized warfare. At the time, it had seemed abstract, perhaps exaggerated. Sitting now in a cave lit by electric bulbs powered by fuel that would eventually run out, while the sky outside still echoed with distant shells, the phrase felt suddenly literal. In frontline caves, platoon leaders and company commanders had no access to those strategic discussions. They had only what they could see and hear. A platoon sergeant in one of the ridge positions wrote in his small notebook when he had a few minutes between alerts. His words were simple. When they attack, the ground moves. We stay under cover until we must fire. When we do, the sky responds. There is always another plane, another shell. We move deeper into the cave and wait. Sometimes the entrance is blocked and we dig out. Sometimes we cannot. He did not mention numbers or factors. He simply described daily life under a continuous, layered bombardment. Yet those simple observations reflected the larger reality that Yahara and his fellow planners were grappling with. Each time an American Marine division pressed forward, it did so with the combined backing of divisional artillery, corps artillery, naval gunnery, and air power. Where that division paused, The guns paused too. Where it advanced, the guns advanced in effect, reaching out ahead of the infantry. That unity of effort meant that the American infantry did not fight alone. In a very real sense, the entire industrial base behind them walked with them, step by step, transformed into shells, bombs, and fuel. Yahara studied the map once more before turning in for a brief rest. There was still a battle to fight. The defenders were still in their positions. The caves still held men who would not abandon them easily. But the colonel understood now that the contest was not between two roughly similar forces meeting on difficult ground. It was a collision between one army that had brought everything it owned to a single island, and another that was, in effect, supported by a continent. By late April, the strain on the Japanese defensive system became more visible. Reports arriving at Shuri began to include phrases that had not been common in earlier campaigns: ammunition exhausted, communications lost, unit strength reduced beyond effective level. In a makeshift signal room deep in the cave, operators sat at wooden tables, headphones on, hands hovering over dials and keys. On a large board, clerks moved small tags representing units along thin lines indicating their last known positions. Occasionally, a tag would receive a small chalk mark indicating heavy casualties. Sometimes, after hours of silence, the tag would be moved to a separate column on the side of the board. Cut off. No contact. In the early days of the battle, these movements had been rare. Now they happened more often. An operations officer walked over to Yahara one afternoon, carrying a sheaf of flimsy message forms. "Colonel, this is the latest status from the 62 ND Division's right flank. Their artillery reports only a handful of rounds left for their heavier pieces. Several mortar units are down to their last boxes. They request guidance, continue firing as needed or conserve for a planned decisive moment." Yahara read the messages, then placed them on the table. "There will be no perfectly chosen decisive moment," he said. "They must use their remaining ammunition where it has the greatest immediate effect. Saving shells for some ideal scenario will simply mean they are captured unused when positions fall." He spoke calmly, but inside he felt the weight of the choice. Every shell fired now might stop, or at least slow, an American push. Every shell saved might never be fired at all. It was a balance between tactical need and the dwindling reserves that existed only on that increasingly sparse chalkboard. On the American side, artillery officers also worried about ammunition, but in a different way. In a field tent behind the lines, Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, commanding an artillery battalion supporting the 1st Marine Division, looked over his own charts. The numbers under his gun's ammunition columns were large, and they were replenished regularly. His concerns were not about running out entirely, but about efficiency, coordination, and avoiding friendly fire in a landscape crowded with both attackers and defenders. His radios connected him to forward observers embedded with the infantry, to co-level fire direction centers, to liaison officers aboard the ships offshore. Using these nets, he could request additional support from heavier guns or offer his own battalion's fire to support neighboring units. For Yahara, hearing about such systems after the war would be like listening to the workings of an elaborate machine whose inner gears had never been visible during the battle. During the fighting itself, all he saw were the results: enemy shells arriving with remarkable speed and precision whenever Japanese positions revealed themselves. Inside the caves, the physical and mental strain grew. The constant background noise of artillery and aircraft had become a normal part of life. Men spoke louder to be heard over it. Dust settled on everything. Air in some deeper sections grew stale. When entrances collapsed or narrowed, units had to decide whether to expend precious energy and time digging them out, knowing that the opening might again draw enemy fire. One evening, a divisional engineer officer visited Shuri with diagrams of cave systems that had been partially sealed. In several places, he explained, pointing to cross-sections he had sketched, the blasts have not destroyed the interiors but have shifted enough rock to reduce ventilation and access. Our men inside can survive for some time, but their ability to fight effectively once they emerge is diminished. So positions that look intact on a simple map may already be neutralized, an operations officer said quietly. Yes, the engineer replied. They are present, but not fully functioning, like limbs that can no longer move. That image stayed with Yahara. Externally, the Shuri line still existed. On the map, the front showed only modest shifts. But the reality behind those lines was changing. Some units remained strong and cohesive. Others, on paper still present, had been reduced to scattered groups holding individual caves under increasingly difficult conditions. At the same time, Japanese attempts to move reserves suffered from the same firepower disparity that affected everything else. A small motorized column that might have moved quickly along a road at night in earlier campaigns now risked being spotted by flares, radar-directed gunfire, or roving aircraft. Even animal-drawn carts, once the backbone of Japanese logistics, were vulnerable on open routes that could be reached by artillery. Messaging from Army headquarters to units in the field increasingly shifted in tone. The language of planned maneuvers and scheduled counterattacks gave way to phrases emphasizing local initiative, holding as long as possible, inflicting maximum delay. There was no sense of surrender. Such a notion did not fit the mental world of many of the officers. But there was an emerging recognition that the original strategic objectives, a long, controlled battle that would inflict unbearable losses on the attackers, was slipping out of reach. In one of the nethermost levels of the Shuri cave, Yahara occasionally found a few quiet minutes to sit alone on a low bench near a stack of crates. In those moments, the distant noise seemed muffled, and he could think beyond the next report or decision. He knew that elsewhere on the island, his counterparts in American headquarters were also working late into the night, studying maps, adjusting plans. The difference was that when they requested more guns, more shells, more fuel, ships offshore and factories far away responded. When he requested more of anything, he was told, gently but firmly, that what they had was already on the island and no more would come. The imbalance was not simply a matter of who had more guns at a particular point. It was a question of who could adapt, replenish, and sustain those guns over weeks and months. In that sense, the firepower quotient, this idea that a single American division brought the effective equivalent of many Japanese divisions, was not an abstract ratio. It was a reflection of an entire system's ability to focus and maintain force in one place. And that system was pressing, relentlessly, toward his caves. Outside the planning rooms and signal centers, the Japanese defensive line experienced its own internal transformation. There had been a time when the 32nd Army could still adjust its front line by choice, rotate units, shift companies between sectors, reinforce weak points with reserves. That time faded as the battle went on. By May, movement itself had become dangerous. Near the southern end of the island, a battalion of the 24th Division attempted to reposition two companies under cover of darkness to plug a growing gap. The much-practiced procedure, moving in small groups, using ravines and tree lines, keeping noise and light to a minimum, had worked on other fronts. This time, observers in American lines saw silhouettes against the faintly lighter sky. Flares popped overhead. Within minutes, artillery from multiple batteries bracketed the suspected route. A few survivors reached their destination. Most were forced to scatter, finding refuge in whatever depressions or caves they could reach. The battalion commander later sent a short, stark message to Shuri, relocation attempt largely unsuccessful. Movement after dark now triggers immediate response. Enemy surveillance and coordination exceed previous expectations. In the Shuri cave, this message joined others on a board labeled Operational Limitations. The list grew: daylight movement restricted, night movement increasingly dangerous, radio use at risk of interception, cable lines vulnerable to bombardment, motorized transport highly exposed. In effect, the defenders were being fixed in place. Fixing an opponent is a classic military goal. For the Japanese, it had been part of their own doctrine in earlier campaigns, pinning down enemy units so they could not reinforce other sectors. On Okinawa, they were experiencing that same effect turned back upon them with a magnitude enhanced by modern command and control. American units, by contrast, retained flexibility. When one regiment ran into particularly strong resistance on a ridge, headquarters could divert additional artillery, call for naval fire, or shift supporting tanks and engineers to that sector. If another part of the line offered less opposition, units there could be directed to exploit those weaknesses. The Japanese command still issued orders, but increasingly these orders became reactive rather than proactive. Instead of shaping the battle, Yahara and his colleagues were responding to its pressures, trying to maintain cohesion where the strain was greatest. One of the most telling indicators of this change was the condition of the Japanese artillery. At the beginning of the campaign, their guns were central to the defensive plan. Carefully sighted, concealed, and supplied, they were meant to break up landings, disrupt advances, and punish concentrations. As the weeks passed, those guns were gradually suppressed, knocked out, or rendered almost silent by lack of ammunition. An artillery officer at Shuri summarized the situation during a briefing. "Before the landing," he said, "we could plan to fire on a scale comparable to the enemy in shorter engagements, even if our total stocks were smaller. Now, after repeated counter-battery fire and the intensity of their barrages, we must choose each fire mission carefully. Their artillery coordinates with their air units and ships in a way we cannot match. Many of our remaining guns must reserve what little ammunition they have for truly critical moments. In practical terms, this meant that when American troops attacked a position, the defenders often had only local small arms and mortars to respond, while behind the American front stood a vast, integrated fire support system. From his vantage point in the southern cave network to which the Army headquarters had eventually withdrawn, Yahara watched these trends with a mixture of professional clarity and personal concern. He had spent his career studying strategy and operations. He knew that wars turned on numbers, logistics, and morale. He had also believed, like many in his generation, that skillful planning and determined resistance could offset material inferiority. Okinawa did not disprove the value of planning or determination. It did something more subtle. It showed what happened when those qualities met an opponent whose ability to create and sustain force was another order entirely. In late May, as the Shuri line began to buckle under continuous pressure, the headquarters relocated further south, into a new cave system closer to the island's tip. The move was necessary to avoid encirclement. It was also symbolic. The command post that had once sat at the center of a broad, layered defense now sat at the edge of a shrinking pocket. The journey itself had been conducted at night along secondary tracks, with minimal vehicles and strict radio silence. Even so, small groups moving between positions reported near misses from artillery that seemed to anticipate likely routes. Once settled in the new location, Ushijima and Yahara held a conference with their remaining senior officers. "The situation is clear," the army commander said, his voice quiet but steady. "We have held longer than some predicted. Our units have fought with great commitment. But the enemy's superiority in firepower and supplies has steadily worn down our ability to resist." He looked across the room. "From this point, we can no longer speak of organized maneuver in a classic sense. Our task is to maintain resistance as long as any units remain able to fight, to impose whatever cost we can within our means." No one challenged the assessment. They could all see the same figures on the boards, the same shrinking pools of ammunition, the same casualty estimates. Later, when historians would ask Yahara about his impressions from those days, he would often return to the contrast between pre-war theory and wartime reality. "We had believed in will," he would say. "We had believed in the power of a well-prepared defense on difficult ground. But on Okinawa, we encountered a form of warfare where an enemy division could bring down upon a single ridge the concentrated output of distant factories, coordinated through systems we did not possess. We did not yield because we lacked courage. We yielded because our tools were finite and there seemed, for the scale of that battle, without limit." He did not mean that literally, of course. No system is truly without limit. But from the vantage point of caves in southern Okinawa, watching American ships, guns, and aircraft continue to operate at high tempo week after week, the difference felt close enough. As May turned into June, more and more of the island south of Shuri resembled a landscape that had been rearranged by heavy machinery. Ridges that had once been sharp were now pocked with craters and scarred by blast marks. Trees stood shattered or burned. The entrances to many cave systems were buried under debris or sealed by earth moved by armored bulldozers. In some pockets, Japanese units still held out with remarkable persistence. The terrain itself, honeycombed with natural and artificial cavities, allowed small groups to remain hidden even when larger formations had been pushed back or broken apart. For American infantrymen and Marines, the fighting in these final sectors remained difficult and dangerous. Cave-by-cave clearance operations required close coordination between rifle units, tanks, engineers, and fire support. Each new hillside could contain hidden positions that had survived previous bombardments. Yet over the entire front, patterns now favored the attackers more and more. When a particularly stubborn cave complex held up an advance, forward observers radioed coordinates. Artillery and aircraft revisited the site with fresh concentrations. Engineers brought forward tools specifically designed for such problems: explosives, specialized vehicles, heavy equipment. The process was hard, but it followed a playbook refined over 3 years of Pacific combat. Japanese defenders, by contrast, were improvising under steadily worsening conditions. In the southern cave headquarters, Yahara's daily reports painted an increasingly stark picture. Artillery, almost entirely silent. Mortars, many tubes damaged or without rounds. Small arms, limited ammunition. Food and medical supplies, low and difficult to distribute. communications, fragmentary. At one briefing, a staff officer pointed to a section of the map that had once been colored with unit symbols. This area, he said, was previously held by elements of 3 different regiments. Yesterday, we received a brief message from one surviving officer who reported that his group now consists of fewer than 50 men scattered across several caves. Their radios are out. He used a runner. He does not know what units remain to his left or right. The army commander listened in silence. So, he said quietly, on this map, we see lines. In reality, we are dealing with isolated groups. Yes, General, the officer replied. In one of those isolated caves, a young Japanese soldier named Tanaka sat against a wall, back sore from days of interrupted rest. The air was warm and thick. Somewhere deeper inside, a few lanterns gave off a faint yellow light. He had not seen the sun in several days. From time to time, the ground shook as bombs or shells fell somewhere above. The sounds no longer came in intense, brief barrages as often. Instead, they arrived in irregular pulses, as if the immense firepower that had once been concentrated around Shuri was now distributed across a smaller area, still powerful but more focused on individual pockets. Tanaka's company commander, once a precise man with carefully pressed uniform, now sat on an overturned crate, his hair dusty, sleeves rolled up. They will keep coming, he said quietly to the few men gathered near the entrance. Each time we fire, they will answer. Each time we hide, they will search. This is not because they are individually more skilled than you. It is because they have built a way of fighting that brings strength to wherever they decide to look. He did not speak of ratios or industrial output, but his words echoed what Yahara and other senior officers had concluded. In the American command posts, officers were drawing their own lessons. Major Robert Henderson, responsible for beach logistics, walked along a row of supply dumps carefully labeled and arranged. Shells of various calibers in neat stacks. Fuel drums organized by type. Crates of rations piled in precise rectangles. Trucks and jeeps moved in steady flows under the direction of military police and logistics NCOs. He paused near a stack of empty shell crates marked with the names of marking factories thousands of kilometers away. Each crate represented rounds fired in support of infantry moving through the ridges. Each name on the label represented a facility in the American interior where workers had assembled those rounds. The link between those distant places and this scarred island was not abstract. It was as concrete as the labels under his hands. For Henderson and his colleagues, the challenge had been to ensure that the artillery, aircraft, and tanks never had to pause for lack of fuel, ammunition, or spare parts. For the Japanese defenders, the challenge had been simply to make what they had last as long as possible. In that sense, the comparative figure that had so shocked Yahara early on, that a Marine division could bring perhaps 12 times the firepower of a Japanese division, was not just a measure of guns per kilometer. It was a reflection of whose logistical network could maintain that density. On June 4th, the Japanese attempted one last coordinated counterattack near a key airfield. From his vantage point in a forward observation post, Captain John Miller of the Marines watched as Japanese troops assembled and advanced. It was a brave move, timed between bombardments. But within minutes, American units called in support. Artillery batteries that had been resting shifted to new missions. Naval guns added their voices. Aircraft diverted from other tasks changed course. What might have been a disruptive blow in a different war, at a different time, ran into the same integrated wall of fire and steel that had greeted so many other movements. When the attack faltered, Miller lowered his binoculars slowly. He felt no triumph, only a quiet understanding. Their officers know what they are doing, he remarked to a fellow observer. They just don't have the means to carry it through. We, on the other hand, can call half the ocean and sky onto anything that moves. It was a blunt way of putting it, but it captured the essence of what Okinawa had proven. For Japanese commanders like Yahara, the campaign had become an increasingly clear demonstration that theoretical courage and preparation could not, by themselves, counter a sustained application of vastly greater resources. By mid-June, the 32nd Army was, in practical terms, no longer an army in the conventional sense. It was a collection of determined groups scattered across a narrowing strip of southern Okinawa, many without clear links to one another, fighting under conditions that no pre-war planner had envisioned. Within the final cave headquarters near the island's tip, the atmosphere had shifted again. There were fewer officers. Several chairs around the central table stood empty, their former occupants either injured, killed in earlier bombardments, or cut off with frontline units. The maps were more worn, their edges curling, their surfaces marked with layers of annotations. In some places, areas that had once been brightly colored with unit symbols were now shaded with a simple pattern indicating lost contact. Yahara still maintained his routines, reviewing reports, updating his own notes, advising the army commander. But even he knew that their decisions now affected only a fraction of the remaining fight. Many events were unfolding without their knowledge, within caves they would never see. In one of his last conferences with the general, he laid out the situation plainly. "General," he said, "our units have expended almost all heavy ammunition. Our artillery is quiet except for a few isolated pieces. Our mortars are reduced to small stocks. Small arms ammunition is rationed. Medical supplies are nearly gone. Communications with many units have been lost entirely." He paused. On the other side, the enemy continues to fire artillery and naval guns in significant quantities. Their aircraft fly daily. Their tanks continue to operate. Their logistical system seems unimpaired. Ushijima nodded slowly. "We always knew we were outmatched in industrial terms," he said. "We hoped terrain and determination would narrow that gap. We have seen now how far that gap can be stretched. Each of their divisions carries not just men, but a level of equipment and support that multiplies their presence along the front." After the war, Yahara would write that at this late stage, the true nature of industrial warfare became clear even in the most confined cave. "We were not simply facing soldiers," he reflected. "We were facing the power of factories, refineries, and shipyards arranged into a military system. Every shell that fell near our positions was the end result of a chain that began with or in a distant mine and ended with a logistics clerk ticking a box on a form. We had not understood fully, before Okinawa, how completely such a chain could dominate a battlefield." For the American side, the end of organized resistance brought its own reflections. Captain Miller, now promoted and assigned to staff duties after weeks in the line, walked one afternoon through the ruins of the Shuri Castle complex. What had once been a historic structure and an intricate network of tunnels was now a series of collapsed chambers and cratered courtyards. In places, metal reinforcement bars protruded from shattered concrete. In others, the bare rock showed scars where the heaviest shells had struck. The ground was uneven, littered with fragments of equipment, personal items, and debris. He stopped at the edge of a crater and looked out over the surrounding ridges. The silence was striking after so many days of constant noise. One of the division's intelligence officers joined him. "Hard to imagine this place under bombardment now, isn't it?" the officer said. Miller nodded. "To think that every one of those craters was a ship firing from miles away or a battery behind the lines," he replied. "When you add it up, it's like a whole country focused on this one spot for weeks." "That's more or less what the numbers say," the intelligence officer responded. "The ammunition expenditure reports are impressive. Naval gunfire alone, nearly 300,000 rounds of 5-inch or larger. Our artillery over 2 million rounds of all types. Thousands of tons of bombs from aircraft." Miller let out a slow breath. "And they," he said, nodding toward a collapsed tunnel entrance, "had whatever they brought in their packs and those caves." "They still made us pay for every ridge," the officer replied quietly. "But yes, the balance was never equal." In the weeks after the fighting, American staff began to compile formal studies of the campaign. They listed the number of guns per kilometer of front, the tonnage of supplies delivered, the sortie rates of aircraft, the casualty figures. They analyzed successes and failures, looking ahead to possible operations on the Japanese home islands. Japanese officers, those who survived to be taken into custody, also reflected on what had happened. During one interrogation, Yahara was asked to compare the firepower of Japanese and American divisions. He considered his answer carefully. "A Japanese division is structured very differently from an American Marine division," he said. "Our divisions have fewer organic heavy weapons, and we relied on Central Army resources and terrain. When you consider their divisional artillery, their attached corps artillery, their naval support, and their aircraft, one of their divisions could bring on a narrow front more than 10 times, perhaps 12 times, the firepower of one of ours. This was not just theory. We saw it every day." The interrogators noted the phrase. It would appear later in summaries and analyses, each U.S. Marine division effectively possessing many times the firepower of its Japanese counterparts. But for Yahara, that realization had not come from reading captured manuals or analyzing diagrams. It had come from listening to the relentless pattern of bombardments, watching ammunition boards empty, and seeing planned countermeasures fail for lack of resources. The end of organized resistance on June 21st did not bring immediate quiet everywhere. There were still isolated holdouts, caves where small groups chose to remain hidden. Yet, in terms of large unit operations, the battle was effectively over. American engineers moved in swiftly to convert the island's facilities for future use. Airfields were repaired and expanded. Naval anchorages were developed. Supply depots were formalized. The same logistical system that had brought guns and shells now shifted to building fuel storage, maintenance shops, and housing. The transformation was striking. Within weeks, the island that had been the site of intense fighting became a functioning forward base, complete with scheduled flights, organized docks, and stockpiles of material intended for operations that, as it would turn out, would never be carried out in the form originally planned. Okinawa had been meant to serve as the stepping stone for an invasion of the Japanese home islands. Instead, it became one of the final large land battles of the Pacific War. For the Japanese commanders who had defended it, the campaign left behind not only memories of hardship and loss, but a deep understanding of what it meant to face an opponent whose firepower was not just greater, but multiplied through industrial organization. In the months and years that followed, as documents were studied and accounts recorded, Okinawa came to be seen as something more than just another battle. For many analysts, it was a demonstration of how land warfare had changed when connected to modern industry on a global scale. For the Japanese officers who had lived through it, that change was not a matter of abstract theory but of lived experience. When Colonel Yahara later wrote about the campaign, he devoted many pages not to dramatic charges or close encounters, but to tables of artillery fire, ammunition stocks, and the structure of divisions. He described, in measured language, how the defenders had prepared caves and ridges, how they had calculated their own firepower, and how they had assumed that careful planning could make up for at least some of the disparity in equipment. Then he described the first day he saw the full American fleet off the Hagushi coast, and the first time he reviewed captured fire direction charts showing how the Americans coordinated their guns. From the moment we saw their charts, he wrote, we understood that their divisions were not merely units of men. They were frameworks for integrating enormous amounts of supporting fire. A single division could call upon artillery, naval guns, and aircraft with a speed and accuracy we could not hope to match. It was not just that they had more. It was that they had learned how to use more, all at once, in the same place. He emphasized that Japanese troops had not lacked willingness to fight. They had held out in caves under conditions that would have broken many others. They had attempted counterattacks when chances of success were small. What they lacked were the material tools and systems to translate that determination into sustained operational effects. On the American side, veterans who returned home years later would remember Okinawa as one of the hardest campaigns of the war. The casualty lists were long. The terrain and the determination of the defenders made every kilometer costly. Yet when those same veterans encountered Japanese accounts of the battle, they were sometimes surprised by the perspective from the other side. Many had felt, in the midst of the ridges and caves, as though they were engaged in a grinding, uncertain struggle where small units fought for every yard without always sensing the larger picture. Reading Japanese reflections, they realized how powerful the overall American system had appeared to the defenders, how overwhelming the combined weight of artillery, air power, and naval support had seemed from inside those caves. One Marine who had served as a forward observer summarized the difference neatly many years later. At the time, he said, I was just doing my job, calling in fire, adjusting rounds, coordinating with other units. I didn't think of it as directing a country's whole industrial strength at one hillside. But in a way, that's what it was. The Japanese soldiers up there just saw that whenever they moved or fired, something very large answered. That something very large was the product of factors that had been building long before the first Marines set foot on the beaches. Factories that could produce weapons in great numbers, shipyards that could deliver and maintain a massive fleet, training pipelines that turned recruits into crew members for complex systems, and doctrines that integrated those elements into coherent operations. Okinawa showed what happened when all of that was concentrated on a single campaign. Each U.S. Marine division on the island carried, on paper, a certain number of guns, vehicles, and personnel. In practice, through attachments and support, each division had access to far more than its own tables indicated. When Japanese observers like Yahara calculated that such a division possessed perhaps 12 times the firepower of a comparable Japanese division, they were not indulging in exaggeration. They were capturing, in numerical shorthand, a reality that had manifested itself every day in the sound of shells and the sight of aircraft. The experience left a deep impression on those who had commanded in that environment. Some Japanese officers later argued that the lesson of Okinawa was the futility of conventional defense against an enemy with that degree of industrial advantage. Others focused on how such power could make future wars so destructive that alternative paths would have to be found. For American planners, Okinawa raised its own questions. If so much firepower had been required to secure a single island at such cost, what would an invasion of the home islands have demanded? How many divisions? How many ships? How many rounds? Those questions would be answered in a different way when the war took its final turn that summer, but the figures calculated in the wake of Okinawa were sobering. In that sense, the island became both a culminating point and a warning. It showed that in mid-20th century warfare, a division was no longer just a formation of infantry and a few supporting guns. It was a node in a vast network that could channel industrial output directly into combat. For the Japanese commanders in their caves, that insight had come too late to change the outcome on Okinawa itself. But their observations helped future generations understand precisely what they had faced. They had entered the battle believing that carefully prepared positions and determined troops could hold against a superior for long enough to alter the course of the war. They emerged from it, those who survived, not only with stories of hardship and courage, but with a clear recognition that they had confronted a new kind of opponent. An opponent whose divisions, backed by a continent's factories and fleets, carried a level of firepower that was not just greater, but multiplied. That realization, more than any single bombardment or final assault, was what truly unsettled the Japanese commanders. They had not simply been outnumbered. They had been outproduced, outsupplied, and outsupported to a degree that turned tactics into a secondary question. On Okinawa, in the spring of 1945, each American Marine division did not merely stand opposite its Japanese counterparts across the ridges and ravines. In practical terms, it towered over them, its firepower multiplied many times, casting a long shadow that reached into every cave and tunnel where officers like Yahara unfolded their maps and tried, with the tools they had, to plan against a force whose true strength was measured not just in men, but in the relentless arithmetic of industry.